Hey YouTube friends, I hope you guys are doing well. I have not recorded a video in a while, so it's gonna take me a little bit to get used to talking at my phone, but I went through the suggestions I got from the community tab where I asked you guys what kind of stuff you want to hear me talk about, and I don't remember if I actually landed on this from the suggestions or not, but there are so many things that you guys mentioned that I will talk about in the future. So I'm going to start a list of the topics, but I really wanted to talk about references and the use of references and a bunch of stuff adjacent to the topic that comes up here and there. I've listened to videos by different art YouTubers addressing this particular topic. I've listened to many of them, and I think that there is a pretty clear consensus in the art community in regards to references. I think a lot of artists have the correct opinion that it is something that's necessary and it's a good thing, and they generally encourage people to use references as much as they can, and like the general, I guess, idea seems to be to discourage people from stigmatizing the usage of references, which is totally fair, and I think it is correct. The reason why I actually wanted to talk about it myself is because my opinion maybe is slightly different, or I guess my overall sentiment about references leans in a slightly different direction from most of the videos that I've listened to. However, I don't think they're wrong, and I think they are correct, generally speaking. It's just that I wanted to talk about a couple of things that I don't really hear come up, and it seems to be seldom discussed. So yeah. So I really hope that I don't devolve into incoherent rambling and can actually keep on point. Maybe I should have typed this out before talking about it at length, but regardless, I did make some notes, so hopefully I'll be able to stick to the topic at hand. So, first of all, I do think that not using references is impossible, and everybody does it, whether you're aware of it or not, and mostly it kind of starts when you decide to pick up drawing, because you kind of have to have some sort of jump off point, otherwise you won't really know what to draw at all. And everybody has been in this boat, and of course so have I. The reason why I've brought this up as the first point to make is because I can understand pretty well where I think people are coming from. The people that the rare people that think that using references is a bad thing and that you shouldn't, and that it's cheating, which it's not, and I don't agree with any of that, but I just wanted to explain why I think I understand where these people come from, because I think that for a large, I don't even know how to really put a time frame on it, but basically for a huge amount of time, like a stretch of maybe 10 years or something, I was under the impression, maybe somewhat subconsciously, that using references is to be avoided as much as possible, and that it's something that does in fact feel like cheating, even if you can argue that it isn't. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, but not just yet. So I want to start with the fact that, like anybody else, at the beginning of the art pursuit thing that many of us decide to do, like just when you start to draw a lot and start taking it seriously, usually it takes some sort of catalyst to kind of propel you in that direction. And that catalyst is more often than not some sort of obsession with like an IP, like a TV show or a comic, or just some sort of media that you really, really love. I think it's really common for artists my age and maybe younger, and like just within my generation or something, for anime to be the kind of instigator for getting into art. And when it starts like that, I mean, personally, I had an inclination toward drawing before I even knew what anime was or was watching cartoons regularly. But it wasn't until I really became kind of obsessed with a TV show, which was Sailor Moon in my case, and Pokemon right before that. It wasn't until then that I actually started to draw a lot, and it became like a regular part of it became like a serious hobby. Whereas before it was kind of just like, oh, whatever, yeah, sure, I like to draw, but I didn't have like a plan every time I sat down, which this all changed when I became kind of obsessed with whatever it is that I was obsessed with at the inception of my interest. So the reason why I was talking about that is because inevitably when you become really interested in something, and that's why you get into drawing, you will use that as a springboard for most of the stuff that you draw. So like a lot of people even just duplicate images from anime that they like or cartoons that they like. I was not in that particular group, but I did look at the artwork a lot, and I guess I don't really remember using it. I don't remember duplicating images, but I guess naturally I was kind of more inclined into to analyze the stylistic components of images rather than try to duplicate a specific image. So I guess I was instinctively kind of looking for patterns right off the bat, which is not something that everybody does, but it does happen. Anyways, it's still referencing, I guess. I was looking at a lot of images, and I remember at some point at school, like, I was one of those obnoxious kids that would go into the computer room and just use up all the printer paper printing out like Google images of Sailor Moon manga cutouts or whatever. So I did that, and then I would just stare at those things like intently, and I would just try to mimic the style, because I've always wanted to draw my own thing. So as soon as I got obsessed with it, I pretty much just wanted to make up my own like new Sailor characters or whatever. So I didn't want to duplicate, like I said, existing images, but I wanted to draw my own in the same style. So technically that is using references. And where am I going with this? I'm just trying to define what even constitutes using references, I suppose. I think that duplicating an image is copying, and then using a reference is taking certain parts or trying to distill certain information from an image, but transforming it when you make your own. That's using a reference. And tracing, obviously, is self-explanatory, and I'm just gonna quickly talk about tracing just to get it off this subject, because technically it's kind of related. So I think that tracing is totally redundant, and I think it's a waste of time unless you're already a very skilled artist, in which case it can sometimes be a time-saving hack. But I mean, I don't really use it myself, so I don't think there's any reason to trace, because it takes all the work out of it, and it takes all the learning out of the activity, and it's just, I think it's a completely pointless thing to do. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about copying and referencing. So I think copying has a place. I think a lot of people start out by copying images, just duplicating. I think doing that without tracing can actually teach you a lot, because if you're trying to accurately copy an image, you have to be really observant to certain things, such as how far apart things are from each other, like in relation to each other, and being able to eyeball stuff like that without tracing is actually really, really useful, and I think it teaches you a lot. Like I said, I don't really recall ever doing that specifically, so I'm just not gonna talk about it any more than that. I think it could be useful, but I think generally it's something to help out a person who literally has no idea where to start at all when it comes to drawing, I think it's a good place to start to copy pictures. But I think it's something that you shouldn't get stuck on as a beginner. Anyways, so now that I've kind of addressed the issue of copying and or tracing, referencing is the only thing that's left to talk about. So I don't even know where to start, but first of all, I want to give my 2 cents about the common thing that goes around that people say often, which is there's no such thing as originality and everything is a copy and everything has already been done, and essentially nothing is original, is something that I've heard come up many times in regards to this topic as an extreme form of retaliation toward the exact opposite statement, which is you can't copy because then that makes you unoriginal. So I think that it's a dangerous way of putting it. I don't agree that nothing is original. I think it's pretty sad to come to the conclusion that literally everything's been done already. I think that's kind of ridiculous, all things considered. I think it's absolutely possible for people to come up with new things. How can it not be? I mean, when an artist distills their own style, the combination of things previous, just because it has elements of something else and it doesn't make it unoriginal. So I think it's redundant to throw around the phrase nothing is original, because I think that's just incorrect in many ways. And even if it's something that people are willing to argue on, I just think that it's kind of an extreme way of putting something that's a lot more nuanced than that. I'm just editing the video now, and I've listened over the audio several times, and there's just a couple of things that I want to add. The first of which is, so why do I think it's a dangerous thing to say that nothing is original? Well, simply because it's an oversimplification and kind of like a very abrasive statement to make. I just think that it muddles the definition of originality, and it's frankly just an unnecessary accelerated swing of the proverbial pendulum, so to speak. If I were to collect my thoughts on this matter, I'd probably say just that the most efficient approach lies somewhere between trying to draw without visual aid and using references. Anyway, so that being said, I wanted to kind of backtrack and talk a little bit more in more detail about what I mentioned earlier about the fact that I spent many, many years subconsciously harboring the belief that referencing is wrong, and I tried to avoid it at all costs, and the fact that I felt like it was cheating and all that other stuff. So first of all, I want to make it clear that I don't think like that anymore, and it's still kind of a battle for me to change my attitude or change my emotional response to this issue, and kind of make my attitude toward using references healthier and to try to use them more often. So that's something that I'm currently just in the middle of addressing with myself. And the reason why I wanted to talk about it is because I had to really think at length about why I had those thoughts in the first place and why I believed that I shouldn't reference as much as I can, or why I believe that referencing is something I should only do if I absolutely must. So basically I kind of tracked down where those feelings started for me and what instigated them and what essentially made me take those thoughts as my own. So in my particular case, I think it has everything to do with the feedback that I got from a lot of adults / people in position of authority over me when I was younger. So when I just started to draw, and when it became like a thing that I had to show to teachers and stuff at school and whatnot. So this basically happened in high school. I think in high school is where my attitude toward using references seriously changed, and it has everything to do with the fact that I was often dismissed instantly because certain teachers thought that, oh, I just copied whatever it is in my portfolio and that my portfolio is fake, and I did not actually draw. Like, I basically, they didn't give me any credit for my work, even though it wasn't actually even copied. I was inspired stylistically by certain things, but like I said, I've never actually duplicated images. And aside from lifting stylistic elements from the artists that I was inspired by, I didn't do a whole lot of even referencing, actually. It's just something that I never thought about at the time, regardless. But with the increasing number of feedback of the sort that I got from teachers and such, I started feeling super resentful about it. And I think that I kind of internalized that, and to me, I started to notice the kind of like, it made me think about what it means to copy things and what it means to reference. I mean, when you're a kid, you kind of, like, I obviously had the negative attitude toward copying and tracing, but referencing didn't really make it into that category. When I was a kid, I always thought that I didn't want to copy because I thought that I could do better than that, which I evidently could, so I didn't copy. And tracing is something that never occurred to me because it seemed pointless from the get-go. So when I was accused of, or when I was dismissed based on the grounds that I allegedly just copied everything, which is why it's not something that I could ever get positive feedback for, I began to think, like, oh my god, so is the only way for me to get any sort of positive feedback and or approval is to create artwork from scratch without looking at anything at all? And I did this on a regular basis anyway, but I started to become way more avoidant about looking at things while I was drawing, and I became more paranoid about things like using references. So basically, to me, I just kind of adopted this really negative attitude toward using any sort of aid to help me draw, because I didn't want to feel like I didn't want to feel the terrible feeling that I felt when I was accused of just being unoriginal and just copying things and basically having all the value stripped away from my work based on people's assumption that it was copied, right? So that was kind of like a long-winded explanation, but I do think that that's why I had such a negative view on it for so long. And obviously, when you work really hard at something, you want to take pride in it. And I was kind of like, not that this is a sob story or anything, but I didn't get a whole lot of praise when I was little, or in general from like my parents and stuff. And I feel like my relatives were different in that regard, but I did not see my relatives at all past the age of like 11 because we immigrated to Canada. So it was just basically me and my family, and I was pretty desperate for positive feedback and praise from adults, you know what I mean, from people whom I trust and whose opinion apparently, or what it seemed like, mattered, you know, which, you know, it does when you're little. So all I ever got from my dad was that he basically hated anime like everybody else, and he especially hated comics, and he always thought that it was like a cheap form of art and it wasn't really art at all. And he didn't really give me much feedback aside from like scoffing and just general total lack of approval in any way whatsoever, and just endless criticism of all sorts of stuff. But I mean, at that point in time in particular, it was more dismissive than anything. He started being way more critical later on, but anyways, the point is that I was just desperate to at least feel like at least I know that I didn't look at anything and I didn't copy anything, and therefore even if the adults in my life don't acknowledge that or don't give me any positive feedback, at least I will know myself that I did it and I can take some sort of pride in that. So basically that's what kind of drove me for a large span of time, for like years, you know, like years and years. And even in college, I kind of still had this attitude subconsciously. So when I say this, I'm not saying that I never actually used any references. I did draw from life sometimes. I obviously went to many life drawing sessions, and I think that's a different topic altogether, so I'm just gonna kind of not talk about that and ignore it. But when it comes to creating artwork, my general rule and how I approached it was I will draw as much as I possibly can without using any aid from anywhere else, and then only use it if I absolutely need it. And usually that constituted drawing things that I've never drawn before, or such as objects. Like for instance, if you asked me to draw like a TV, like I have a general idea of what a TV looks like, but obviously I'd need to look up a picture to get all the details correctly, right? Or to figure out how big it is in relation to a person. TV. What an example, truly. You'd have to go out of your way to think of a worse example to make in this situation, because most TVs just look like a reflective dark rectangle and have zero detail. But anyways, a better example would have probably been a horse or a house or a car, for God's sake. But moving on, etc. So stuff like that, like for specific objects that I haven't really drawn before and can't just imagine on the spot, like I obviously always looked up a reference, and so I wanted to kind of think about whether that hurt or helped me in the long run, because to be frank, I don't know that I just don't know which one it is. At some point I thought that, like when I started adopting a more healthy attitude toward references, I started to think about how, oh my god, like maybe I just wasted so much time trying to avoid them as much as I can, when I could have been learning so much by using references and etc., you know? I thought about that, and I was a little bit heartbroken because of that for a bit, because I just thought that, man, I just really just shot myself in the foot, because maybe I could have made so much more progress if I just wasn't so stubborn. Then again, I wasn't exactly like aware of this attitude that I had. It's just not something I really thought about too much, right? But later on, I thought about it again, and I thought about how it, first of all, it made drawing really difficult. I mean, it didn't always feel difficult, but generally it wasn't like the easiest activity to do. However, it was always fun for me. But now when I use references, like it's so easy that it's laughable. And I don't even know where I stand on that, because the struggle of learning how to draw stuff without looking at anything, basically how I quote unquote used references, is that I just tried really, really hard to remember details. It just made me like really detail oriented when it came to things that I'm interested in. For instance, like clothing, I've always liked drawing clothes. So when I looked at my own stuff, or stuff that I like, or stuff that other people wear, I would really fixate on the small things, like how clothes are structured, where the different pieces come together, and the really small details, like the little buttons or the tiny little buttons on the jeans on the side that don't seem to have any purpose, what kind of pattern is on the back pocket, and like just random little details like that. When you really pay attention to stuff like that and try to retain that information in your head, it's really easy to pull it out when you're drawing. Like, you don't need a reference for that if you stared at it long enough, is what I'm trying to say. So, you know what? Technically, that is using a reference, but that's not how most people talk about it. That's not what most people talk about when they talk about using references. So, I gotta be honest with you guys, I don't know where I land on this exactly, but I think that doing a little bit of both is good. But anyways, I think I've kind of talked about the same thing. I've been stagnating in this one point for a long time now. So I kind of just want to move on and address a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about. So I actually think that there is a specific point after which you can allow yourself to use more references. And there's a point of there's a specific thing that you need to learn, I think, before using references at all. And I think that specific thing is structure. So I don't know really how to define what structure is, but the best way that I can boil it down is you have to be able to look at an object and break it down to the simplest shapes that it's made out of. And if you can do that in your head and on paper, if you can construct an object with its basic shapes, then with no problems, without looking at anything else, just in your head or on the piece of paper, then after that is when you should be using references for everything else, right? Or even if you're gonna... So the point that I'm trying to make is that even when I watch people paint, like I've seen some YouTube videos where people are doing their painting and they're using some sort of reference, and a lot of the time what I notice is that I can clearly see that there is still struggle when it comes to structure, and trying to replicate or trying to use a reference heavily for an image, it seems kind of like it should be the next step. I think that one of the most important things to learn is to be able to draw an extremely simple version of a human body or the object or whatever it is, the scene that you're trying to draw, in 3D shapes. And then once you can do that without having to reference anything at all, that's when you can start using a lot of references. I don't know if this actually makes any sense to you guys, but the reason why I say this is because when you look at extremely detailed images like Kim Jong-gi, or you guys probably know who that is, and any other sort of, like, any artwork that, I mean, I can think of so many. This is so common. Like, you can make something look super impressive with a ton of embellishments, but it all falls apart when there's no structure, which is why structure should always come first. And I actually think that using references too much at that crucial point in your in the learning basics or whatever, it can actually kind of make you stagnate, and I think it can make you rely too much on an outsized source of visual information, if that makes any sense. I think it's super valuable to be able to construct whatever you want to draw in a very basic way without looking at anything. And then once you learn how to do that, it will just make your life so much easier. Like, seriously. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of the point of this video, which is learn structure before you rely on references. So, backtracking a little bit, like I said, I don't really know where I stand on it exactly personally, because I find that when I have references to use in terms of like lighting and color, God, it's just so simple. And I think the only reason why it seems simple to me is because I spent so many years struggling to construct basic things without looking at anything. And so I think the advantage that I just have in terms of this step is that I've had so much practice having to do it without relying on reference that I can do it now pretty quickly and with pretty good accuracy. And once you can construct an object in its basic form, putting the little details on top of that is super simple. It's so simple. So yeah. Okay, so to wrap it up and to protect my ass from potential indignation from those who might get offended by the notion that references shouldn't be relied upon, which, by the way, is just a current opinion that is subject to change, I specifically chose this older recording of an illustration I did of my characters to kind of go along with the general topic of this video. I don't talk about the process at all in the voiceover because I recorded it way before deciding on the footage that I was going to use, but this is a good example of how I usually go about making artwork. It's actually the first time I think I've used digital footage, and for those of you who don't know, I actually do a ton of digital artwork, probably a lot more in volume than I do traditional, but anyways, that's irrelevant. So I usually just make a sketch on paper without references, and I take a photo and send it to myself. I make a PSD file and make a clean sketch on top of the photo. In this particular case, I went an extra clean on this one because I just didn't have time for warm-ups that day, and that actually reflected very poorly on the artwork in some specific areas that are glaringly obvious to me now, looking back, but anywho. You can see that I brought references into the image later on in the process because I'm drawing very specific clothing items here, and also popped in a picture of one of the girls because I wanted to get her likeness correctly since I haven't drawn her a whole lot and her face is kind of specific and angular. I just wanted to make sure that she looks like herself, and her name is Zero, by the way. But anyways, yeah, so I'm drawing very specific clothing items here because this was a promo illustration for a British vintage-inspired clothing brand called Miss Bettina, and they sent me these items to try, which I really love, by the way. But yeah, so the references were brought in for the specifics of the clothing, like for the colors and the small details. And also, I'm a freak and I love to deconstruct and recreate patterns, so I spared y'all from watching me meticulously fill that plaid dress one square at a time. So anywho, after inking and doing the flat colors, I have no need for references, so I just removed them. In the background is a photo I took while walking in the park, and I blurred it and used it as a backdrop. So once the backdrop was in, I just made a bunch of assumptions about lighting and colors, which is basically what I always do. And is it perfectly realistic? Hell no. Is it close enough and visually appealing? I think so, to me anyways. And that's pretty much the goal here. It's not perfect accuracy or anything like that. You might have been able to tell that the way that I add shadows is half guesswork, half intentional, technically incorrect exaggeration in order to make something stand out. And I really think that not having other images to look at, it really just helps me make quick decisions and rely on what I know instead of what I see to make the image look good. Basically just design principles. So for example, there was some dusty blue in this piece, which is nicely complemented by the orange, and I wanted to preserve the blue as an accent, which is why I picked a warm toned background. I'm a fan of simple color schemes, so a lot of decisions like that I just make on the go, and when you make a lot of decisions on the go, it's really tough to have references kind of there to aid your every decision, and honestly I sometimes find them to be a hindrance because I like to spontaneously make a lot of decisions, which is why I never plan exactly what an image will look like in the end prior to getting down to it, I suppose. So, what's the point of this video? I guess I just wanted to share my attitude towards using references and provide a maybe slightly different take on the matter from what you generally hear from people on YouTube these days, and I guess in the art community. Yeah, do I think that you should use references? Absolutely. I just think that it might be wise not to rely on them too much, and always remember that if you take the time to learn the basics, having no references will not stop you from making a nice looking image and will most likely make you actually work much faster. I work pretty fast, and the less references I have to look at, actually, the faster I can finish a piece. But I should also say that it's a different experience for everybody, and the only thing to take away here is that you have a good, long, art-related ramble to keep you company while you work on your own stuff. So that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next one. I have some very exciting updates coming up. Bye!